Hello, and welcome to another Rouge unit of the week. And today we're taking a look at the SU-76M PT. In 1942, the Red Army was looking for a self-propelled gun mounted with the ZIS-3 cannon, and by later in that year they came up with the SU-76, which essentially was just a T-70 chassis, lengthened slightly, and mounted with an open-top ZIS-3 cannon. Production would start in December of 1942, but after the first 500 vehicles or so, they ended up making a few modifications, mainly with engine issues, and this would be known as the SU-76M, which the majority of vehicles of the SU-76 name are of this M modification variety, and they made over 14,000 of these vehicles by the war's end. And on the battlefield, it fulfilled a multitude of roles. It could act as a rather effective light assault weapon, as with its open-top capability, it could able to communicate with friendly infantry rather easily, and while you're just using it to blow up bunkers and buildings whenever needs a high explosive shell in its face. It could also elevate the gun rather high, allowing it to act as an artillery weapon, and it could shoot up to 17 kilometers with the cannon. And as well, it could also act as a tank destroyer, and yes, by 1943 standards, as ZIS-3 wasn't the greatest of guns, especially against German heavy armor, but you gotta realize the majority of the time you weren't engaging German heavy armored units. And as well, with the low profile of the vehicle, it made it perfect in ambushes, and they'd end up issuing some SU-76s with AP shell shells to help try and bridge the gap in regards to penetrating more German heavily armoured vehicles. In-game, the SU-76M PT is a 45-point tank destroyer, available to 19th Tank, 3rd Guard Mech, 7th Mech, Group Beslugo, Group Viborg, 3rd VDV, 44th and 84th Infantry, 7th Estonian Infantry, and the 1st Polish Infantry Division. It has one weapon, and that weapon being the ZIS-3 gun, with 8 AP shell shells, 28 regular AP shells, and 15 high explosive shells. AP shell shells are pretty decent in terms of penetration, but they don't do great damage once you penetrate, meaning that they're much less likely to get a one-shot kill. The regular AP shells are still pretty decent. You can still use them to blow up Panzer IVs and Stugs, especially at closer range. And the high explosive shells are actually not that bad, because the ZIS-3 gun is pretty good at that role. It's relatively accurate and has, standard range for a gun like this, but you do have 10 rounds a minute, which is pretty damn fast for a tank gun of this caliber. Up down to the miscellaneous stats, it has 35mm of front armor, Reek top armor, 15mm at side, and 5mm at back. It does have a radio, which is pretty damn useful. It goes 26 kilometers off-road, 31 kilometers on the road, has medium stealth and good optics. So in battle, the SU-76M PT is a pretty cool little tank destroyer fire support vehicle. With the SU-76 kind of being a jack of all trades, this one is a little bit more specialised in the role compared to the artillery version of the SU-76, where you have less high explosive shells, no smoke, and you also cannot shoot indirectly with the PT model, but you do make up for that with a much better AP loadout and more importantly AP shell shells, which definitely gives you a much better killing power, especially against more heavy German armour. The 76M really kind of fills in that role that T-34 76s do. This is 10 points cheaper compared to the 43 model of the T-34 76. But yes, you have less armor, and you don't have machine guns and less high explosive shells for dealing with infantry. But the main thing is, well, you have the AP shell shells, and more importantly, almost double the fire rate. At 10 rounds a minute means that you can very easily get 1 or 2 shots off most tanks before they can get a single shot off, which definitely helps out in those tank engagements. And speaking of tank engagements, this thing is not super ideal at long-range firefights like with a lot of the 76mm Russian gun vehicles. You want to be using them more in close quarters in forests and kind of around towns and whatnot. The majority of divisions get only a single card as SU-76Ms, unless you're 7th Estonian or 3rd Guard Mech. You get 2 cards. The availability, however, is pretty much standardized with 4 and 8 phase, 8 and B phase, and if you're lucky, you may have a C phase option of 12 of them. This is definitely a unit which I'd argue is much better in the A phase, as during that phase. There's usually less heavy armoured vehicles on the field, and also it's relatively cheap for getting in an opener, considering that you can get 4 of these guys for just about 180 points, which isn't that bad. The thing also has the rather nice benefit of common river radio. It won't be able to take advantage of the radio itself, but if you do have radio-controlled artillery in your backline, which honestly isn't too common with Russian units, it's pretty damn nice, because this thing is going to be on the front line, so you're going to have pretty good radio coverage on deep enemy position, if you keep this thing alive, that is. Overall, the SU-76M PT is a fantastic knife fight and tank destroyer. It definitely fills more of the role of a T-34-76 compared to your more longer range S-35s where you want to keep them back. Even though this thing doesn't have a turret, don't feel too scared bringing this through forest or trying to get close quarters. It can still defend itself somewhat reasonably against infantry thanks to the fast fire and high explosive shells. Yes, you don't get a lot of ammunition, but it's enough before it eventually dies, usually due to whatever. But even if it does die, who cares? It's 45 points. You blow up a single German tank with this, you pretty much paid yourself off. And if you can keep it in those knife fighting positions, it will definitely be a very worthwhile vehicle. And personally, I just have a pretty big soft spot for the SU-76. I think it's a pretty cool vehicle as a cool jack of all trades, master of none, with the ability to fill in a multitude of roles. And most video games usually do a pretty poor job of implementing it and just treat it as a crappy tank destroyer. Even though this unit in particular is treated as a crappy tank destroyer, quote unquote. But by God, it's pretty cheap and still pretty effective. And I think that's enough rambling for this week, so I'm going to leave it off at that. This has been another Rang Rouge Unit of the Week. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and as usual, please just take it easy.